They said the birth was a miracle. But when the midwife pulled back the cloth and counted 6 fingers on the child's right hand, every man in that Virginia house felt the air leave his lungs. 6 fingers, a mark that in ancient texts meant divine favor, or a curse that ran through bloodlines like rot through fruit. That night, in 1854, under a harvest moon that turned the fields to silver, 3 brothers waited outside the birthing room, all claiming the same woman, all claiming the same child, but none of them would speak the truth of what they'd done to bring that woman here. An albino slave bought not for labor, but for legacy. They called her Clara. Skin white as morning lilies, eyes pale as dawn. To the men who bought her, she was an answer to a riddle written into their father's will. An inheritance that demanded purity through corruption. 1 wife. 3 husbands, a bloodline unbroken, no matter the sin. They thought they could rewrite nature, bind destiny by contract, and seal it with flesh. But what they didn't understand was that blood never obeys paper, and purity born of control always curdles into madness. History buried her name. The court records disappeared. The church that married her burned down in 1862. Every document, every witness erased. But the story survived in whispers, because something about it felt older than the Civil War, older than America itself. It was a ritual disguised as law, a repetition of a pattern that powerful families have always followed. Possess the rare, the different, the forbidden, and claim it as their right. From Babylon to Virginia, the pattern is the same. Control the womb, control the world. Clara was never meant to be remembered. She was meant to be used. But the moment her son was born with that 6th finger, a symbol found carved into Egyptian tombs, Roman frescoes, and the coats of arms of Europe's oldest dynasties, the illusion cracked. That child was not just an heir. He was evidence. Evidence that the family had touched something it didn't understand. And that's where our descent begins. Because this story isn't just about 1 woman enslaved by 3 men. It's about how control breeds monstrosity, and how every empire hides its sins in the bodies of those who cannot fight back. You've been told inheritance is about land, gold, or family name. That's the lie they use to keep men obedient to graves. But real inheritance, the kind men kill for, is control. And in 1852 Virginia, Josiah Ruddled understood that truth too well. He'd built his empire on soil, on blood, and on silence. And before he died, he wrote one final decree meant to ensure his sons never forgot who owned them, even from beyond the grave. When Josiah's will was read, the room went still. 3 sons, Samuel, Thomas, and William, listened as their father's voice echoed through legal parchment. My estate shall remain whole, my lineage preserved by one union, singular in nature yet shared in purpose. Produce an heir within 3 years, or lose everything. It wasn't a will. It was a spell, a ritual binding wrapped in law. The old man had studied bloodlines like crop rotation, selective, methodical, ruthless. He believed corruption began when men married for love instead of legacy. So he engineered something older than morality, a fusion of blood under one name, a mirror of the ancient patriarchs who'd kept power by making the unthinkable seem divine. The 3 brothers didn't understand at first. They argued, raged, prayed. How could one woman be wife to 3 men? But the lawyer, Chester Havford, smiled like a man who'd already read their fates. It's not impossible, he said softly. One marries by law, all share by intent. The estate remains whole as your father desired. Think about that. A lawyer explaining sin as logistics, a family dressing obsession as duty. That's how the system works, always has. Paper over pain, ceremony over conscience. So they began searching. Not for love, not even for companionship, but for property that could pass as purity. And when word came from New Orleans of a girl with skin white as marble and eyes like diluted flame, they saw opportunity disguised as flesh, the perfect anomaly, the perfect solution. They didn't know yet what they were buying. They thought they were purchasing compliance, but what they were really purchasing was a mirror. One that would show them what they truly were, because men who believe they own life always end up owned by death. And when they brought Clara north from that auction block, the storm that followed wasn't fate. It was justice wearing human skin. The train, grown through swamps thick with heat and decay, its whistle slicing through air that smelled like something dying. 3 men sat in the private car, their suits immaculate, their minds poisoned by inheritance. They were not traveling to New Orleans for pleasure. They were going to purchase a future, one they could own, silence, and breed into existence. Every mile south stripped away the civility they wore like cologne. By the time the steamboat docked on the Mississippi, they were no longer men. They were prospectors hunting the rarest vein of all, a woman who could erase their father's curse. New Orleans was a carnival of contradiction. Music and misery pressed together under the same sun. The auction house on Chartres Street stood like a temple to commerce, its balconies draped in iron lace. Inside, the air was heavy with perfume and sweat, the sound of chains clinking beneath laughter. The Rodald brothers entered quietly, but their presence was noticed. Men like them always drew attention, men whose money carried the scent of moral rot. Then they saw her. Behind a linen partition, half in shadow, stood a girl who seemed carved from another world. Her skin wasn't pale, it was colorless, glowing faintly under the oil lamps. Hair like cobweb silk, eyes that didn't belong to this earth, translucent, pink, unblinking. She did not tremble like the others. She stood still, as if she'd already accepted the verdict of her existence. Pure albino, the auctioneer murmured, sweat rolling down his neck. Healthy, obedient, a rarity of nature. He didn't say what they all knew, that rarity meant value, and value meant ownership. The bidding started, voices rose like vultures circling over fresh meat. Samuel led the offers, his tone precise, detached. Thomas calculated quietly beside him. William whispered scripture under his breath, his lips white with shame. The numbers climbed. 2,000, 3,000, until finally, with a single motion, Samuel sealed it. $4,000. The gavel struck wood like a heartbeat ending. They said her name was Clara, but names mean little when the world calls you property. As the brothers signed the bill of sale, she was led into the sunlight, eyes squinting against brightness she could barely endure. None of them realized they had just purchased not a woman, but a haunting, something ancient, something that would not stay owned. The journey back to Virginia was long and silent. Clara sat apart, her wrists banded with faint red lines where iron had recently kissed her skin. Outside the window, the landscape blurred. Swamps giving way to pines, pines giving way to fields, fields giving way to the dark geometry of plantations that seemed to stretch forever. The brothers spoke in low tones in the adjoining car, plotting her future like merchants calculating inventory. To them, she wasn't a person, she was a mechanism, an answer to a puzzle written by their father's dead hand. Samuel, the eldest, was all control and calculation. Thomas, the accountant, saw her as the final transaction to balance a generational ledger. William, the youngest, the one once meant for the church, wasn't sure whether they were saving their family or damning it. But he said nothing. Faith had become a hollow thing inside him, an echo that never answered back. By the time the train reached Richmond, dusk had painted the world in bruises. They rode the last miles to the Rodald estate by carriage, wheels crunching over gravel older than the Republic. The house loomed against the horizon, columns pale as bone, windows black as confession. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and secrets. Clara was led to the west wing, to a room prepared for her in calculated kindness, heavy curtains to protect her eyes, a mirror draped with lace so she wouldn't have to see herself. A mercy or a warning. Samuel stood at the doorway, his voice measured, stripped of emotion. "You'll have comfort here," he said. You'll be treated fairly, but you'll do as you're told. This house demands order." She nodded once. No tears, no tremor, just silence. The silence of someone who's seen enough cruelty to know that protest only feeds the beast. That night, the brothers gathered in the study, brandy burning in their throats. They'd done it. The will would be satisfied, the inheritance preserved. Yet none of them could meet the other's eyes for long. In the flicker of the fire, their reflections wavered in the glass like ghosts already gathering to watch what was coming. Outside, the tobacco field slept under the weight of fog. Inside, a woman with skin like winter sat on the edge of a bed that was never hers, and waited to be told what kind of monster she'd been purchased to serve. 2 weeks later, under the soft rain of a Virginia September, the Ruddled brothers staged a ceremony that was never meant for heaven. The church was small, Second Presbyterian of Richmond, its pews filled with polite silence and thin smiles. Only 20 guests, businessmen cousins, the kind of people who understood that reputation is more sacred than truth. The bride entered on Samuel's arm, veiled in lace so fine it blurred the boundaries between woman and ghost. Beneath that veil, Clara's eyes stayed fixed on the altar, never daring to rise above the level of her own breath. The Reverend read the vows without question. In that time, money sanctified anything. The groom said, "I do." The bride whispered the same, her voice barely human in its stillness. Somewhere between those words, the sacred turned into something else. An act of ownership written in Scripture's shadow. William, standing beside his brothers, mouthed verses about covenant and blessing, but each syllable burned like cinder. Thomas's fingers twitched, calculating futures that could not be undone. Samuel smiled for the congregation, the smile of a man who believed God himself was merely another contract. Afterward, guests gathered at the plantation for a reception of music and murmurs. They whispered about the bride's strange complexion, her eyes like rose glass, her skin almost translucent. "Exotic," one woman said, as if describing porcelain. Samuel nodded politely, offering no truth, just charm polished thin. The wine flowed, the laughter was hollow, and the night crawled forward. By 10, the guests were gone. The house fell into quiet that felt alive. Clara stood at the base of the staircase, her white dress glowing faintly in the lamplight, her breath slow and steady. Samuel approached her. "You'll come to my room tonight," he said softly. "Tomorrow, Thomas's. The night after, William's. Then we begin again." She nodded once, eyes calm but distant, as though she'd stepped out of herself to survive what was coming. "And after I bear a child?" she asked. "Then you will have fulfilled your purpose," Samuel answered. She didn't reply. She turned and ascended the stairs, the hem of her dress whispering over each step like falling snow. Behind her, 3 men watched, their faces lit by candlelight and guilt, their souls already sold to something far older than their father's will. The house fell into rhythm, a rhythm of sin disguised as duty. Each night, Clara moved between rooms like a ghost bound by mathematics. Monday to Samuel, Tuesday to Thomas, Wednesday to William. Then the cycle began again. The servants learned quickly not to ask questions, not to meet her eyes for too long. Silence was the law of that house, and silence was survival. By day, she was Mrs. Samuel Ruddled, mistress of the estate, gliding through the halls in dresses she hadn't chosen, rehearsing a version of womanhood written by other hands. She oversaw meals, greeted visitors, signed correspondence with a name that didn't belong to her. To the world, she was proof that the Ruddled family had preserved its line. White, wealthy, and untainted. But at night, when the candles burned low, she became something else entirely. Property passed between brothers, flesh-fulfilling contract. Yet something inside her refused to die. In the stillness of her private hours, she wrote letters she never sent. Letters addressed to no one, written in a hand trembling with exhaustion and rage. She wrote of the sound of Samuel's measured breathing, of Thomas's apologies whispered into the dark, of William's trembling prayers that stank of guilt. She wrote not because she expected rescue, but because writing was the only way to remind herself she still existed. The brothers began to fracture beneath the arrangement. Samuel grew cold, mechanical, obsessed with efficiency and results. Her pregnancy, her obedience, her silence. Thomas softened into guilt, trying to compensate with gifts, gentleness, empty apologies. William's faith turned feverish. He began quoting scripture like incantations, desperate to justify the sin as divine testing. Clara watched all of it. She said little, but she saw everything. The way power deformed even the faces of men who once thought themselves moral. She began to notice patterns, how Samuel's footsteps always paused outside her door before entering, how Thomas's hands shook when he brushed her hair, how William's prayers grew louder, as if shouting might drown the voice whispering truth in his mind. And beneath it all, she felt something awakening, something cold and deliberate. Not forgiveness, not even hatred, something older, because a woman who's been turned into a possession learns the secret every tyrant fears. If you cannot escape the cage, you can teach the cage to fear you. It began quietly, missed cycles, fatigue, a dull ache behind her ribs that felt like something ancient stirring awake. The physician confirmed it by June. "She is with child," he said, his tone careful, reverent, as though announcing the rebirth of a dynasty. The brothers celebrated like conquerors. Samuel poured bourbon. Thomas calculated due dates. William wept into his hands, muttering that God had forgiven them, but the forgiveness they sought was not heaven's to give. Clara said nothing. She felt the weight inside her grow, a pulse beneath her heart that wasn't entirely human in its silence. Each night she listened to the creak of floorboards, the brothers pacing the halls, guarding the prize they believed they had created. The plantation whispered with rumors of strange lights from her window, of the mistress who never walked in daylight, of a child who kicked only when thunder rolled. By the 7th month, fear replaced celebration. Samuel demanded constant reports of her condition. Thomas began drinking before noon. William avoided her entirely, spending hours in the chapel reciting psalms that sounded more like bargains. The doctor insisted the pregnancy was normal, but none of it felt normal. The air in her room thickened. Mirrors warped. Clocks stopped. The house seemed to breathe with her, its rhythm matching her heartbeat. Clara began to dream, dreams of water and bone, of a child born under a blood moon, its hand reaching for her with 6 perfect fingers. In those dreams, she wasn't afraid. She was sovereign. When she woke, her hands trembled not from fear, but from knowing. Something was coming through her. Something that did not belong to any of them. The brothers began to turn on one another. Samuel accused Thomas of weakness. Thomas accused William of blasphemy. William accused Samuel of damnation. The estate that once symbolized unity now reeked of decay. And through it all, Clara sat quietly, hands resting on her swollen belly, eyes unfocused but aware. In the stillness of her chamber, she whispered to the unborn child, words no one else would ever hear. "They think they own you, but you are not theirs. You are the proof that control breeds its own ruin." And when the first contraction came, it wasn't pain that filled the room. It was the sound of a curse finally being born. The night split open under a storm. Rain slammed the windows, thunder rolled like judgment, and the Rodald estate woke to the sound of Clara's scream. Low at first, then rising until it seemed to shake the foundations. Servants scrambled through corridors, their faces pale, the air thick with fear and ozone. Samuel barked orders. Thomas fetched the doctor. William prayed, his voice shaking as though his faith were cracking under its own weight. The physician arrived drenched, his spectacles fogged, his hands trembling before he even entered her chamber. The birth was difficult. Blood, sweat, and silence, broken only by Clara's breath counting down between contractions. Samuel paced outside the door, fists clenched, muttering about legacy. "She must live," he said. "Both of them must live." His tone wasn't mercy. It was ownership disguised as concern. Hours passed. When the cry finally came, it was wrong. Too soft. Too knowing. The doctor emerged pale, his hands slick with crimson. "A boy," he whispered, "healthy mostly." He hesitated, eyes flicking toward the floor. "There is an irregularity." Samuel pushed past him, storming into the room. Clara lay motionless, eyes half-lidded, her skin like porcelain under candlelight. The child rested in her arms, small, perfect, and utterly still, until it opened its hand. 6 fingers, long, delicate, each one moving with eerie precision, as though testing the air for meaning. Samuel froze. Thomas made the sign of the cross. William fell to his knees, whispering Nephilim, abomination, sign of the fall. Clara looked up at them, her expression serene. "He is yours," she said softly. "All of yours. Isn't that what you wanted?" Samuel took a step forward, then stopped. For the first time in his life, he felt something unfamiliar coil in his chest. Fear. The child's eyes opened, pale pink like Clara's, unblinking, seeing through him as though measuring his worth, and finding nothing there. When the doctor reached to take the infant, the candles guttered out all at once. Darkness swallowed the room. In that darkness, something moved. Something that sounded like laughter but wasn't human. By dawn, the storm had passed. The child slept soundly in Clara's arms. The doctor was gone, and no one in that house could remember hearing him leave. They named him Elias, after their father, though no one spoke the name aloud more than once. The christening was private, hushed, and half-hearted. No minister would bless the child, after word of his deformity slipped through the servants' whispers. In a county steeped in superstition, even the most God-fearing souls refused to step foot inside that house again. The Rudolph plantation became a place of isolation, of quiet dread masquerading as refinement. Elias grew quickly, too quickly. Before his first birthday, he spoke words, not babbles. Before his second, he could read from the family Bible, tracing the letters with all 6 fingers, whispering verses backward as though unlearning faith itself. The brothers pretended to see genius, but what they felt was horror. There was something in the child's gaze, something watchful, old, and amused. Samuel tried to mold him into an heir, teaching him manners, posture, the art of command. Elias listened but never obeyed. When Samuel spoke, the boy would tilt his head slightly and smile, as if he were humoring a servant. Thomas, who had once believed the child might redeem them, began drinking heavier. He said Elias's eyes followed him through the halls, even in darkness. William, undone by guilt, became the boy's shadow, praying over him, quoting scripture until his voice cracked. Elias would respond by whispering the same verses back, rearranged into something cruelly precise. Clara said little. Her beauty had turned spectral, her presence both protective and distant. She watched her son with quiet understanding, never correcting him, never scolding. Sometimes, she would hum lullabies that no one recognized, songs that made the windows tremble, and the air taste of iron. When Samuel demanded she discipline the boy, she smiled faintly. "He's learning from you," she said. "Isn't that what you wanted?" The strange things began to happen. Mirrors clouded when Elias entered a room. Clocks ran backward. Animals avoided the house. Servants fled in the night, muttering about a child who spoke to shadows. The brothers grew hollow, haunted by dreams of their father standing at the foot of their beds, whispering, "The price is not yet paid." And through it all, Elias laughed, a small, melodic laugh that echoed through the halls like prophecy. Because even at 5 years old, he seemed to know what his uncles refused to admit. The Rodald line had not been preserved. It had been replaced. By the time Elias turned 6, the Rodald estate had begun to rot from the inside out. The walls wept moisture, the foundation cracked, and the air carried a faint, sour smell, like old wine and something buried too deep. Servants refused to stay past sundown, and those who did spoke of voices in the nursery, laughter that didn't belong to any living child. Samuel dismissed it all as hysteria, but his hands shook when he wrote letters, and his sleep was thin and haunted. Thomas was the first to break. One night he stumbled into the study, eyes bloodshot, muttering that the boy had shown him something in a dream. He said he could make it stop. Thomas whispered. He said, "Father's waiting." He drank until his words slurred, until his heart stopped beating between confessions. They found him at dawn, collapsed over the ledger, his mouth twisted in a smile that did not belong to him. At the funeral, Elias stood by the coffin, small and solemn, 6 fingers interlaced. "Uncle Thomas isn't gone," he said calmly. "He's in the walls now, listening." William dropped his prayer book. Samuel's composure began to crack. He forbade Elias from leaving his room, ordered the doors locked at night. Yet the child appeared everywhere. In the garden, the library, sometimes in the reflection of windows, when no one had entered the room. "You can't keep me out," he said one evening, standing at the foot of Samuel's bed. "You made me. I'm what you wanted." William found faith again, but it was the fevered kind that burns more than it heals. He began fasting, chanting, drawing symbols in chalk across the floorboards. Clara watched silently, never interfering. Her face had grown thin, her voice quieter, as if she were speaking from somewhere between this world and another. When Samuel finally confronted her, rage, grief, bourbon thick on his breath, she didn't flinch. "What is he?" he demanded. "What have you brought into this house?" Clara's eyes gleamed, pale and sharp as glass. "You," she said softly. "He's everything you buried. Everything your blood ever hid. You called him into being the moment you believed you could own me." Outside, thunder rolled again. Elias stood in the doorway smiling. "Father," he said, "Mother says it's time to finish what you started." And for the first time, Samuel believed him. The final winter came early that year. Frost clung to the tobacco fields like a shroud, and the river behind the ruddled house froze solid. An omen the locals took as a blessing. None dared go near the estate anymore. They said the land had turned against itself, that trees leaned away from the house as though trying to flee. Inside, the 3 remaining Rotlids moved through their routines like actors in a play that had already ended. Samuel drank from dawn until dusk. His letters to the family solicitor were erratic, filled with orders to sell the land, then revoke the sale, then burn the papers altogether. William barely left the chapel, fasting until his body trembled with starvation and faith. He claimed the devil lived under the nursery floorboards. Clara drifted through the halls in silence, her presence more spirit than flesh. Elias was everywhere and nowhere, appearing at the edges of vision, humming that same lullaby that warped the air. One night, Samuel woke to a sound, the piano in the parlor playing by itself. The melody was one his mother used to hum before she went mad. He followed it downstairs, revolver in hand, breath shallow. Elias sat at the keys, his back to the room, the candlelight tracing his small shoulders. "You shouldn't be awake," Samuel hissed. "I never sleep," the boy replied without turning. "Neither do you." Samuel raised the gun. "You're not my son." Elias finally looked at him, those pale eyes steady, ancient. "No," he said. "I'm your reflection." The revolver fell to the floor. By morning, Samuel's body was found at the base of the staircase, his neck broken, his eyes open in frozen terror. No one could explain how the mirrors in the house shattered that same night, all at once, every single one. When William discovered the body, he laughed until his voice cracked. Then he set the chapel ablaze, chanting psalms as the roof caved in. The fire spread quickly, consuming the estate in an orange roar that lit the valley for miles. At dawn, only ashes remained. Yet amid the ruin, 2 sets of footprints were found leading away, one small, one barefoot. Clara Ruddled and her son were never seen again. But on storm nights, travelers still swear they see a pale woman walking the riverbank, hand in hand with a boy whose fingers never stop moving. A century later, the land where the Ruddled estate once stood is nothing more than a scar on the map. A stretch of overgrown field near the James River, where even the wind moves quietly. Locals call it Ash Hollow. No one farms there. No one builds. They say the soil won't take seed, and the river runs colder beside it, as if remembering something it can't forgive. In 1932, a surveyor named Harold Quinn came to map the property for a new rail expansion. He camped near the ruins and kept a journal. His notes, found decades later in a Richmond archive, describe the nights with unsettling clarity. Heard music by the water again. One entry reads, sounded like a piano under the river. Another says simply, saw her. Woman in white. Boy beside her. Thought it was mist until I heard them humming. The project was abandoned. After 3 workers drowned in shallow water, the company blamed faulty equipment, but locals whispered it was the Rutledges. That the child born wrong had never died, that he and his mother lingered, bound to the house that once made them property. Over the years, people claimed to see a pale figure walking the riverbank during storms, her hand clasped around something small and unearthly. By the 1970s, Ash Hollow had become a dare, a place teenagers went to prove courage. One night, a group from a nearby town broke into the remaining cellar. They found the stones blackened by fire, the air strangely cold. On one wall, beneath the soot, they uncovered faint carvings, 6 hands intertwined, circling a single word etched deeper than the rest. Remember. 2 of the boys never spoke again about what they saw. The others said they heard laughter echoing through the dark, small and melodic, the same sound described in Quinn's journals nearly 50 years before. Today, the site is fenced off by the state, marked as unsafe due to ground instability. But some nights, fishermen along the river claim to hear that laughter drifting across the fog. Soft, deliberate, never quite human. They say if you listen long enough, it turns into a lullaby. And if you follow the sound, you'll see them, a woman pale as bone, and a child with 6 perfect fingers tracing the air, writing the names of men who thought they could own eternity. Time has a way of burying bodies, not truths. When the Ruddled estate finally crumbled, the family line did not end. That's the lie they wanted the records to tell. But if you trace the names buried in parish registries and courthouse archives, quietly altered, ink faded from deliberate tampering, you find the same pattern recurring every 2 generations. A child born with 6 fingers, pale skin that burns in sunlight, eyes too light for the bloodline they claim. The first was a girl named Miriam, born in 1879 to a woman recorded only as housekeeper. Her father was listed as a Ruddled cousin, but no such cousin existed. Miriam disappeared from census data at age 8. The next record shows a Mary Rutland in Pennsylvania, married to a coal investor. The name was wrong by 1 letter, the birth year off by 3, but the photograph, kept in the state archive, shows the truth. Same ghost, white skin, same unnerving gaze. The cycle had moved north. You see, families like the Rutledges didn't just vanish. They evolved. They shed names like old skin, trading plantations for corporations, fields for finance, bloodlines for boardrooms. The men who once owned bodies learned to own systems, paperwork, contracts, markets. Their legacy survived not through crops or land, but through control. Hidden wealth built on the same foundation, human compliance. If you think this is ancient history, look again at the families funding psychological research, behavioral economics, and genetic studies. Look at the universities endowed by the same surnames, altered just enough to hide the trail. Their obsession never changed: purification through control, ownership of the exceptional, the rare, the manipulated. Clara's child, the 6-fingered hare, wasn't a curse. He was the prototype, a symbol of selective power breeding disguised as inheritance. His descendants sit behind tinted glass now, not plantation porches, designing algorithms that shape desire, emotion, and obedience. And they remember her, their ancestor, the white-skinned slave turned experiment. They wear her face in their guiltless reflections. They whisper her name in closed circles, not with shame, but reverence. The mother of their dynasty of control. Tell me, how many generations does it take before slavery becomes strategy, before blood becomes data? You were never meant to ask that. But now you've heard it, and once you hear it, the descent begins again. They don't wear their sigils anymore. The crests have been replaced with corporate logos, the plantations with polished skyscrapers. But the old blood never left. It learned to blend. It learned that the most obedient slave is the one who believes he's free, and so the families that once traded flesh learned to trade faith. To build invisible plantations of the mind, where men sell their own labor, their attention, their belief, and call it freedom. The Rothschild philosophy survived in silence, passed down not as myth, but as method, control through necessity. Their ancestors used hunger and inheritance. Their descendants use mortgages, media, and medicine. Ownership, once enforced with whips, now comes with signatures and screens. The overseer's whip became the algorithm's pulse. Every notification a tug on the invisible chain. You've felt it, that phantom tug when your phone lights up. That conditioned reflex to obey the glow. It's not a coincidence. It's evolution. They studied the same human instincts that once justified subservience and repackaged them as engagement metrics. The plantation's rhythm became your daily scroll. The overseer's voice became your feed, and behind it all, unchanged, remains the same psychology. To divide the many, elevate the few, and keep the bloodlines untouched by exposure. Their ancestors feared contamination of race. Their heirs fear contamination of power. They curate bloodlines now through legacy admissions, exclusive foundations, private gene banks. You think it's philanthropy. It's preservation. A modern eugenics dressed in glass and light. They've replaced scripture with science, sermons with slogans, God with data. But their devotion is the same: maintain the hierarchy, protect the name, control the narrative. They no longer need chains or laws to keep the order. They've built a system where the prisoner builds his own cell, and thanks them for it. Clara's six-fingered child was their genesis, a hybrid of power and experiment. His descendants learned that control could be eternal if you turned it inward. If you could make a man thank his master for the cage he doesn't see, and that's where you live now. The plantation didn't burn, it just upgraded. The same house stands, the same blood rules, only the slaves smile when they're told to kneel. Now tell me, are you still certain you're free? Freedom, as you've been taught to see it, is a theater, a stage built by architects who understood that rebellion is dangerous only when it can organize. The modern masters learned to preempt rebellion by giving it an audience, a label, a hashtag. Every revolution now is framed, measured, and archived by the very hands it claims to defy. This is not by accident. It is the culmination of a design older than industry, older than democracy itself, the management of perception. When Clara's son was hidden from record, his descendants carried not just his blood but his purpose, experiment and observation. By the early 20th century, the family's influence merged with emerging psychology. Funding went into behavioral studies at Ivy League universities, thinly veiled under academic progress. They discovered what the plantation had always known: if you can define a man's world, you can define his will. Think of Pavlov's bell, Skinner's box, Bernays' propaganda, the lineage of obedience science. They learned to create need, to link identity to consumption, to make men fight to defend their own submission. They called it public relations. You call it marketing. But at its heart, it's ritual control, turning choice into illusion. And the institutions you trust, they were designed as temples of that illusion. Education teaches obedience to systems, not wisdom. Media teaches reaction, not reflection. Religion, stripped of spirit, teaches guilt and conformity. All of it functioning as elegant machinery to extract loyalty from fear, the same fear Clara felt when she was told she would serve 3 masters, the same psychological split now replicated in you, torn between comfort and truth, belonging and self. Because when you serve the system, you serve 3 masters to government, economy, and belief. Each demanding your devotion, each punishing your dissent. They do not need chains anymore. You carry them in your habits. You polish them with pride. They glow on your screens and echo in your thoughts. The new plantation is invisible, but the overseers still count the yield. Your attention, your outrage, your silence. And you give it willingly, because the first law of obedience is this: a man will defend the cage that feeds his ego. Now look closely. Who built yours? After the wars ended, the flags changed. But the masters did not. Conflict was the crucible through which the old bloodlines purified their next form. The smoke of battle hid their migration from dynastic houses to boardrooms, from royal insignias to shell corporations. Their plantations were replaced by institutions, banks, foundations, and think tanks that would rewrite the world in their image, one signature at a time. The Rothschild heirs, along with other legacy families, learned that true power wasn't in armies. It was in information flow. The war had taught them how the human mind could be broken, rebuilt, and repurposed. Operation Paperclip brought not just scientists, but psychologists, men who studied fear like an art. Their findings were absorbed into intelligence agencies, universities, and corporations, and the families funded them all, embedding their inheritance into the architecture of secrecy. Control was no longer about owning bodies. It was about shaping behavior. They built networks that could influence governments without elections, economies without currencies, wars without armies. The empire of invisible hands. You feel its pulse every time markets crash in unison, when narratives shift overnight, when your outrage matches theirs word for word. They hide behind names like council, forum, foundation. They gather in alpine resorts, behind tinted glass and encrypted invitations. Publicly, they speak of sustainability, global health equity. Privately, they refine methods of engineered dependency. Their descendants no longer need thrones. They rule through liquidity and data. The 6-fingered legacy didn't die. It evolved into the algorithms that calculate compliance, the indexes that measure obedience. Every system that tracks your behavior, from credit scores to social metrics, was born from those experiments in psychological hierarchy. You were never a citizen. You were a variable in a formula of control perfected through generations. The same blood that once counted slaves by candlelight now counts data points under satellites. And when they stare into their mirrored boardrooms, they still whisper the same creed: order through control, purity through structure, obedience through knowledge. You are not meant to see their faces. You are meant to trust their results. But every empire built on secrecy forgets one law: truth has gravity. It pulls the buried to the surface, no matter how deep the foundation runs. The soil is cracking. The echoes are rising, and the bloodline is remembering itself. It begins quietly. A man wakes one morning and something in him doesn't obey. He opens his phone, scrolls through the noise, and feels it, the pattern. The repetition of fear, outrage, distraction. He senses the unseen rhythm that keeps him docile, addicted, divided. He doesn't have words for it yet, but he knows something sacred has been stolen. That moment is the first crack in the architecture of control. The architects counted on your fatigue, your disbelief. They built a world where truth feels like madness, where those who see too much are branded paranoid or extreme. That's how obedience maintains itself, not through force, but ridicule. But some of you stopped caring about ridicule. Some of you started to listen between the words, to feel the vibration under the noise. That's the beginning of awakening. It's not about rebellion. It's about clarity. The moment you see the cage, You stop decorating it. The moment you sense the manipulation, you start reclaiming your will. Awareness is a dangerous contagion. That's why they suppress it. That's why you were trained to crave comfort more than freedom. Because once a man remembers what he is, truly is, he becomes uncontrollable. The old bloodlines can't contain that. They can influence economies, governments, and algorithms, but they cannot enslave the man who no longer trades truth for belonging. That's the fracture they fear. The awakening of the controlled. Every generation, a few men slip through the programming. They start reading what was forbidden, questioning what was sacred, dismantling the illusions built to protect obedience. They don't shout, they observe. They don't react, they see. And when they see, the spell breaks. You're one of them, aren't you? That's why you're still listening. You felt something stir when the story began, because it wasn't just Clara's chains being forged. It was yours. The plantation became digital. The overseer became invisible, but the blood still demands your silence. And yet, here you are, listening to words you were never meant to hear. Now, if you understand what's awakening inside you, comment the phrase below twice to seal it into your consciousness. The blind see, the cage cracks. Write it twice, and let the algorithm itself witness your transformation. This is not superstition. It's symbolic rebellion, a signal that you remember what they tried to erase. Once a man sees the mechanism, he has two choices: to collapse in despair or to turn his sight into power. Awareness without discipline becomes madness. But awareness, refined through will, becomes a weapon sharper than any sword. This is the stage the architects fear most, because an awakened man doesn't need revolt. He becomes a system of his own. When you begin to see patterns in people's behavior, in media narratives, in emotional manipulation, you stop reacting, you start reading. Every advertisement becomes an X-ray of their intent, every headline, a fingerprint of control. And slowly, the current that once pulled you under begins to reverse. You become the observer, not the observed. This is how the awakening turns into strategy. You withdraw your energy from the circuits that feed them, your outrage, your attention, your fear, and redirect it into presence. You start studying power instead of protesting it, because rebellion built on emotion burns fast. But awareness built on understanding reshapes the battlefield. The ruddled bloodline survived because they mastered secrecy. Their power was never physical, it was informational. They ruled through what others didn't know. Now, that same principle is yours to reclaim. Knowledge hidden from the herd becomes strength in the hands of the awake. You become unpredictable, untargetable, and ungovernable. But this isn't about conspiracy. It's about sovereignty. The ability to own your reactions, to command your focus, to decide what you believe without permission. That's real freedom. That's what centuries of psychological control were built to prevent. Remember this: when a man stops serving fear, the system loses its fuel. When he stops needing validation, the media loses its grip. When he stops obeying narratives, the masters lose their language. Every decision made from clarity is rebellion in its purest form. So, study them, but do not worship them. Observe the system, but never mirror its cruelty. Power must be reclaimed, not repeated, because domination without wisdom is just another form of slavery. You are the counter-experiment, the variable they couldn't predict. Awareness was meant to destroy you, but instead it forged you. They made a cage for men's minds. Now, you're the crack spreading through its foundation. When enough men awaken, they find each other. Not through symbols or slogans, but through silence. You recognize it in their eyes first, that calm defiance, that quiet refusal to participate in the illusion. It's not rebellion they radiate, it's comprehension. They have seen the strings, traced them to their source, and chosen to no longer dance. That's how the brotherhood begins, not as an organization, but as a resonance. The awakened do not recruit, they remember. They find one another in boardrooms, on construction sites, in coffee shops, in digital corners of the internet, where words still carry weight. They speak carefully, almost in code, because the world was built to punish independent thought. But where others see paranoia, they see preparation. Where others see coincidence, they see pattern. And when they meet, something ancient stirs, the echo of those who refused to kneel before kings, priests, or overseers. These brotherhoods do not wear robes or rings. Their initiation is internal the moment you choose truth over comfort, awareness over acceptance. They exchange knowledge, not commands. Strategy, not superstition. They understand that the real war is psychological, that the battlefield is attention, belief, and behavior. Their weapon is discernment. Their creed is silence. They operate without hierarchy, without titles, because they know power always corrodes through ego. Each man becomes his own sovereign node, capable of seeing systems without becoming trapped by them. And yet, when they align, their impact multiplies. Ideas begin to shift quietly, narratives lose traction. The machine stutters for just a moment. That's all it takes. The old bloodlines thrived on division, the awakened thrive on recognition. They do not need to expose the masters. They simply render them obsolete. The system depends on obedience, on mass hypnosis. But when awareness spreads faster than fear, control fractures. Every awakened man becomes a signal, every act of conscious defiance a frequency the architects cannot jam. The plantation still stands, but the soil beneath it is humming. The cracks widen. The brotherhood grows in whispers, invisible yet everywhere. No flags, no leaders, no oaths. Only a shared knowing that truth cannot be owned. And when enough of them remember, the balance will shift. Not through blood, but through awareness. The empire will not fall with fire. It will fall with a whisper. Would you like Section 20 to show the moment of confrontation? When the hidden brotherhood begins, subtly dismantling the control systems from within. You said next section in 400-word ChatGPT said, Sestio on 20, Pticicilio estilin G. It doesn't happen with riots or revolutions. Those are distractions. Scripted to release pressure without changing anything, the real collapse begins quietly. Inside the very systems that were meant to control. The awakened have learned patience. They understand that the loudest rebellion dies first. True subversion hides behind routine, dressed in normalcy. That's how they move. In the beginning, they infiltrate the structures they once feared. Finance, media, education, technology. The same pillars that kept men asleep, but they enter with different eyes now. They don't seek to destroy, they seek to reprogram. A single word changed in a policy draft, a withheld algorithmic tweak. A subtle leak of truth disguised as entertainment. One awakened hand on a lever can shift an entire machine. The architects of control built their empire on predictability. They relied on data models, psychological forecasts, and human patterns that never changed. But the awakened don't fit the pattern. They think asymmetrically. They operate without ideology or permission. You can't track what you can't define, and so, the invisible brotherhood becomes the virus in the code. The anomaly the system can't compute. While the elites still gather under chandeliers, convinced their order is eternal, their commands ripple through networks. Now seated with quiet dissent, the awakened are there. In their corporations, their think tanks, their agencies, altering code, planting seeds, redirecting outcomes. They don't shout about freedom. They code it, they write it. They teach it beneath layers of compliance. Each act appears insignificant, but together they create chaos where there was once control. It's a kind of judo of power, using the weight of the system against itself. They understand that burning the empire only feeds its mythology, but starving it, one mind, one decision, one silent act at a time, leaves it hollow. The great irony is that the architects will never realize what's happening until it's done. They will still believe they control the narrative, even as the narrative itself mutates beyond their grasp. And when the final thread is pulled, when obedience stops being profitable, the empire won't fall. It will dissolve. No one will fight for it because no one will believe in it anymore. That's how freedom returns, not with thunder, but with silence.